Hello and welcome to episode 8 of Double Feature Reviews. I'm Libby.
I'm David.
And today we're talking about Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, or Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and Call Me By Your Name.
So I have not seen Portrait of a Lady on Fire before this. I'd heard a lot about it, but I hadn't seen it. I know I've seen Call Me By Your Name before. We watched it together.
Yeah.
This was a few years ago.
We saw it in theaters when it came out.
I don't I remember the experience of watching the movie and what I saw on screen, but I don't really remember the experience of watching the movie at all. We saw it in the theaters?
We saw it in the theaters. This is when we were living in the Netherlands, so I believe we saw it with Dutch subtitles. And a meaningful portion of the film is in French and or Italian.
You were probably just whispering in my ear for the translational benefit.
I assume that the American prints of the film have the English subtitles translated on the screen. And then I don't know if those were left in and then they also added Dutch subtitles. I can't remember. But do you feel like the first time you watched it, you actually understood what was going on?
Yeah, I don't remember
so I think
feeling like I didn't know what was going on. So I think that we saw it with English subtitles. Okay. That's what I think happened.
Okay.
And I believe I've seen other cases where that happened in the Netherlands. So my guess is that we watched it with English subtitles.
Yeah. We did watch Shape of Water in a Dutch theater, which has a lot of sign language. And there, the subtitles to the sign language are printed on screen like as part of the film. And I know those were in English and they also had Dutch subtitles. So I think there may be some double subtitling going on.
Could have been.
I also have seen Call Me By Your Name another time. I watched it in the best film watching environment on a plane. They did put a warning up before I watched it to say, consider the people around you and if you should be watching this movie. And I was like, you made it an option.
Stop putting those movies on the plane.
Yeah.
Just stop doing it.
That would be better. If you don't want me to watch it, then don't make it available. Also, you gotta know that it's really hard to tell which people actually have an angle on your screen based on where you're sitting. I actually watched a portion of Oppenheimer recently on the person sitting 3 rows in front of me across the aisle.
Yeah, either it's okay to watch this and everyone else has to get over it, or it's not, and you shouldn't put it on the plane. Those are both good solutions, but the current solution is not great.
And I, like you, had not seen Portrait before, but I had heard a lot about it, and I had seen some clips.
So my title for the series is I Saw You, I Felt Us. I think both movies are very focused on the act of perceiving someone and how it is to be perceived by someone and how that is both threatening and alienating, but also inviting and intimate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a really hard time coming up with a title for this series. Did you have a hard time?
I think that there are a lot of titles that just string a bunch of words together and trying to say something evocative, partially because I think both of these movies are well titled and do a great job of kind of giving you a sense of the feeling of watching the movie. And so, my title to some extent came from just trying to push the words in the title together of see, you, feel, me, I am, and it sort of evolved out of that.
Call Me By Your Fire.
Something like that.
Yeah, I sort of struggled because there is a lot about gaze in both of these movies, but I feel like Portrait is much more interested in gaze and Call Me By Your Name is much more interested in the 5 senses as a whole. So I was like, I can either go with something extremely obvious, like My Gay Summer. I also tried the extremely oblique angle with contrapposto. Don't ask me what that's supposed to mean. I don't know what that means. I finally went with unconsumable, which I'm still not entirely happy with, but I feel like there's a lot of, and this may not be an overarching theme for either of the films, but they do frequently bring up unconsumability. Like, you cannot actually consume the subject of a painting, the person in and of themselves. You can only consume the art, and that doesn't give you information about the subject of the painting. Also, Oliver is not allowed to consume that peach. Elio says no. And Elio is not allowed, according to his dad, to consume the feelings that he felt and annihilate them. So I don't love it, but that's the best I could do. This was definitely the hardest pairing I've ever run into to title.
Does Oliver eat the peach?
In the book, he eats the peach.
Right.
He has one bite. In the movie, peach is not eaten because Luca Guadagnino is a coward.
So if you haven't seen either of these movies, I'll give you a short introduction to set some context. For The Portrait of a Lady on Fire, a young noblewoman on an isolated island in northern France refuses to have her portrait painted so she cannot be forced into marriage. Her mother hires a young woman artist to pretend to be her friend and secretly paint her portrait, but they fall in love. For Call Me By Your Name, a teenager falls in love with his father's research assistant in 1980s Italy.
Much more straightforward.
I think that's an accurate summary.
Yeah. Portrait definitely feels like it has two parts to the plot. The before the reveal that she's the painter and after the reveal.
Yeah, I think it's, in a way, surprising, not unintentional, how quickly that reveal comes. Mm-hmm. I think the film sets itself up in the opening and in the marketing kind of expecting that we're going to be living in this world of intrigue between the two young women. But that world doesn't last very long, actually. That's not really what the movie's about. Mm-hmm. Libby, can you tell us who's in this movie? Who made it?
Yeah, so Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, or Portrait of a Lady on Fire, is a 2019 French period romantic drama. It is directed and written by Céline Sciamma. It stars Noémie Merlan as Marianne, Adèle Haenel as Héloïse, Luana Bajrami as Sophie, and Valeria Golino as La Comtesse, who is Héloïse's mother. And that's pretty much the entire cast. Very tight cast. There's a couple other people who have one or two lines, but we're basically only concerned with those four people.
Portrait of a Lady on Fire was filmed in October of 2018 on a budget of $4.8 million. It was filmed on location in northern France over 38 days.
That's pretty fast.
Yeah, it's a fast production. A small cast makes that a lot easier. Most of the time involves moving people around. The less people to move, the faster you can get stuff done. The paintings featured in the film were created by an artist named Elaine Delmaire. This process was extremely grueling for her. She said she worked 16 hours a day for 3 months straight, including weekends, basically painting the same 5 or 6 paintings over and over and over again, so they could be reproduced and shown in different shots at different levels of production. In an interview, it sounded like she was enjoying her time on the film, but it was also very challenging and probably pretty boring. She said she can now paint every painting in the film from memory perfectly.
So it's not that they couldn't decide how exactly they wanted the painting to look and she was making like mock-ups. They actually just needed identical copies of the same painting and they didn't want prints.
Yes. Well, they wanted to film different parts of the portrait being added at different times and from different angles.
So those are her hands.
Yes.
They didn't let Noémie touch the paints.
Absolutely not. The director, Céline Sciamma, said that she very much wanted to see real hands really painting on real canvas in the film, but they were definitely not the real actors' hands. It premiered at Cannes in 2019. It won for Best Screenplay and the Queer Palm. Ended up making about $10 million at the box office, so nominally doubling its original budget. It's been very well received. It has a 97% score on Rotten Tomatoes, an 8.1 on IMDb with about 112,000 votes. Didn't receive any attention from the Oscars or the BAFTAs. Got more award attention in its native France, but not a lot outside. It has received a lot of broad critical acclaim, although that's interestingly gone up and down. In 2022, it was listed as the 30th greatest film of all time in the Sight and Sound Directors Poll.
That seems excessive.
But it hasn't really come up much outside of that. I don't know that it's made the strongest cultural mark since then.
Yeah, I think it's part of the possibly emerging genre, or maybe it's just a micro-genre that's wrapping up, of the lesbian period drama, which I think really started with Carol in 2015. The Girl King also came out in 2015. And since then, we've gotten this film, Vita and Virginia, Ammonite, Tell It to the Bees, The World to Come, and the TV show Gentleman Jack, all of which I would call them the core of the modern lesbian period drama, but there are other ones that are maybe tangentially related, like The Handmaid.
Yeah, it's interesting you link all those back to Carol. Carol was received a lot better than any of those other features.
Yeah. I think people saw a new avenue for making films about queer people because I think falsely a lot of people feel like it's hard to get tension out of a modern lesbian story because women are just like great and lovely. And if they fall in love, if there isn't a societal convention preventing them from being together, then they'll just have a perfect happy relationship. I think you can talk to many lesbians or women in relationship with other women who will tell you that this is not the case. I think it is kind of unfortunate that storytellers, the only source of tension they seem to be reaching for is one that is insurmountable. So most of these lesbian period dramas are also tragedies.
Do you think there are themes particular to lesbian relationships, the internal aspect that films should explore more?
I mean, what are you asking?
Well, you said you want filmmakers to not look for external sources of tension, but internal sources of tension. So maybe you have some tips.
Well, mostly the same ones that straight couples deal with. You know, I don't actually like you is a big problem. The relationship in Portrait of a Lady on Fire ends because society just won't let them be together. The relationship in Call Me By Your Name, although there would be potentially insurmountable societal pressure to not be together, the relationship in that film ends because Elio gets rejected. Oliver wants to marry somebody else.
They're both historical pieces about these questions. I guess you feel like maybe Call Me By Your Name handles that issue a little bit better, more smoothly, more naturally.
I think they both handle them naturally. Actually, that's not true. Just to talk about the ending a lot at the beginning, it's actually not clear to me why Marianne and Eloise can't be together. Like, the thing that's presented is that Eloise is getting married, so she's going to be, legally in a relationship with somebody else, and also that she is moving to Milan from France because her husband is Milanese. But Marianne seems to be pretty mobile. She's obviously not from this island where she's painting Eloise. We know that she's already been to Milan and speaks Italian. Why can't she go look for clients in Milan? They also, in the epilogue, seem to be moving in the same social circles. They are at the same concert. Marianne goes to an exhibition where a portrait of Eloise is being displayed. And the film doesn't actually give a reason for why they can't just sort of be good friends who hang out with each other a lot, maybe spend the night at each other's houses. Like, they absolutely could have had a relationship. And it's really unclear why, if they love each other so much, they choose not to.
Yeah, at the end of the film, at the very end of the film, where Marianne is watching Eloise from afar, Marianne seems very confident that Eloise is still in love with her. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see from the cinematography. Eloise is listening to this piece of music, which she heard Marianne introduce her to, and is appears moved. And that's a reasonable conclusion, certainly from that selection. But to some extent, it does leave open the question, is Eloise necessarily interested in continuing a relationship with Marianne? It almost makes you wonder if there's been any attempt for these two people to contact each other or reform that relationship, because we do see this big cut, and maybe there's a falling out. The narration from Marianne certainly implies that they have no contact with each other. Yes. But maybe that's not the whole story.
Well, if it's not the whole story, then you needed to give some indication of that in the film. Otherwise, that is the whole story. The director's imaginings is not part of the piece of art.
Yeah, I would guess the director does imagine that they just totally cut off contact with each other, and that's that. But I'm not sure that actually fits that naturally with the typical romantic relationship.
Yeah, it's really unclear why they would do that. I mean, there were real-life lesbians in the 18th century, and most of them we don't know about because they kept it sufficiently hidden.
Is Gentleman Jack? That's 19th century.
Yeah, that's like 1830s.
Yeah. Portrait of a Lady is set at the end of the 18th century. It's not in 1712.
It's actually really unclear when it's set, and this is another problem that I have. When do you think this film is set? The primary storyline?
Late 1780s was my assumption from the aesthetic and from the level of technology and culturally, I felt pretty confident.
Okay. I was assuming 1760s because there are several cues that this is 1760s, but there's also cues that this is everything from the 1720s to the 1780s as our primary timeline. And so 1760s is just kind of in the middle of that. So first off, the hair of our main characters is not particularly 18th century in any way. Marianne's is okay, but Eloise with her side part, absolutely not. They'll have these sort of like loose ponytails, or maybe like a bun with a ponytail hanging off of it, which is not an 18th century hairstyle. I had seen the trailer and I had seen some brief clips of this film, and I was really not impressed by the costumes that they were wearing. But I told myself, this is not a Hollywood production. This is a French production. The budgets are way lower. Like, I'm sure they're doing the best they can with what they could afford. The fact that the costumes are not perfect is something that I will move on from. But then when I watched it, every single extra looked better than the leads. So they did have, somebody in the production did have the knowledge, and they did have the budget to costume, dozens of people that we're seeing for 5 seconds or less. And we spent none of this effort on our two leads. So I can only assume that this was an intentional choice to make them look more relatable. And I just don't buy the idea that a modern audience can't relate to people who look different than them. Especially given that they don't have to look different all the time. So you don't have to have your pomaded and powdered hair, combed back over a pomp, or in the sort of cute little curls that Madame de Pompadour wears all the time. Because we also see them in various states of undress. Like, we can relate to them when they're looking like that.
Is Madame de Pompadour the mother?
No, Madame de Pompadour is the mistress of Louis XV. The mother also had 1780s hair despite wearing a 1770s dress.
Is Madame de Pompadour in the movie?
No.
Okay, just checking
in
there.
The real life woman. There's a lot of portraits of her.
Got it.
People can look up Madame de Pompadour and know what hairstyle I'm talking about.
I was really struck by how much our leads, and I'm really talking about Eloise here, look like a modern person. Mm-hmm. Eloise I think she's intended maybe to give the impression as a very forward-thinking, modern type of person trapped in this oppressive historical environment. And I think partially to deliver that, she really looks like someone off the street right now.
And it is interesting because Eloise is from a convent, and she actually seems to really like being at the convent, something that she and Marianne have a conflict over. She seems like she should at least be the most conservative person of our 4-person cast.
Yeah, in the beginning of the movie, the maid, Sophie, who's the third major character, she reveals that Eloise has recently arrived back from the convent. And initially, it's kind of implied that she was kicked out because she's some sort of rebel bad girl. Now, we immediately dispel that idea.
Oh, I didn't get that impression, so if it was there, it must have been very fleeting.
Yeah, we immediately dispel that 2 lines later and say, oh no, it's because her sister committed suicide, and it's actually very sad and dramatic. But I agree that there are lots of hints for the audience that this is our modern person surrogate in the story.
Yeah, and I just find it disappointing that there was such a lack of interest in the how the types of women that this story is theoretically about would have experienced their life. Another smaller thing that bothered me at the very beginning, and I did not start out on the right foot with this film, was that after our opening scene where we see Marianne teaching her students to draw, and then we jump into our flashback. Marianne is in a boat going either to this island, or maybe it's just easier to take a boat along the coast. Not clear. But she's taking a boat to Eloise's house. Her canvases have fallen off the boat into the water, and she just jumps into the ocean and starts swimming after them. Now, if you look at her dress, I don't know what it's actually made out of. It's actually a petticoat and jacket. If you look at her petticoat and jacket, I don't know what it's actually made out of, but it's definitely trying to look like it's made of wool. And wool is very water hungry. If you get in the water, it won't absorb the water immediately, but after maybe 30 seconds, it's going to be too heavy for you to hold up. And so technically Marianne should be dead at the beginning of the film, and she's actually a ghost the whole time. Another problem that I had with that scene, and I'm less confident about this, is how her canvases are being transported. So we see her, they clearly wanted this shot of her like struggling up the cliffside with the bag of her stuff and also this like big wooden box of the canvases on her back. But I know at least for modern painters, when they are delivering their paintings around to various museums, you unnail the frame that the canvas is attached to, and just now you have four narrow rods of wood and a canvas that you can roll up. And I have no idea why Marianne wasn't transporting her materials like that. It seems like it would have been much easier to carry.
Yeah, was that a box of unpainted canvases?
Yes, I mean, maybe if they were painted, I could understand why you wouldn't want to roll it up and maybe crack the paint. I don't know enough about paint to know how this works. But for an unpainted canvas, and we also see her very confidently using a hammer and nails later, she absolutely could have hammered together the frame and then put the canvas back on it.
Yeah, I think the up the cliff shot is really just intended to impress us with her toughness and establish her identity as independent, and she doesn't have support in the world. She's got to do it on her own. I mean, someone
and
of
also,
that wealth.
And also, I guess that she is dumb. That's what it got. I was like, girl, what's in the box? Just unhammer them. It doesn't have to be this hard.
Big Marianne slam right out of the gate from Libby. Let's just get that on record. Yeah, I think it's easy in some ways to compare this movie to another movie that features a scene of a lady jumping out of a boat, The Piano. Mm-hmm.
Does she jump out of the boat?
At the end of the movie.
Doesn't the piano pull her out of the boat? It's been a while since I've seen the piano.
We don't need to parse the piano when it's not the piano episode.
Goes in the water.
But I felt like that was maybe even an intentional visual reference to that sequence from the piano. Mm-hmm. It looked really similar. The way the boat was positioned, the way the camera was positioned inside the boat. I would believe that Ms. Sciamma has seen the piano. I think that's a safe guess.
Yeah.
So that's what it really reminded me of. And this moment of her jumping out of the boat is probably the highest action point in the movie. This is the most...
Yeah, I think it's tied for the Mourir Courir scene, when Eloise almost runs off the cliff.
Oh, that's fair. That's true. That's an almost action scene. We're teased with an action scene there.
She's running real hard.
That's true. She is running real hard. So I think that scene actually does a lot, as short as it is, but especially there at the opening to entertain an audience and give them a sense of momentum and velocity in the story. It does seem, maybe just because I love the piano so much, it does seem like that scene fits better in terms of the tempo of the story at the end, not at the beginning.
Yeah.
It's sort of this conflict all in of itself, and it does a little bit to help us identify with this character, but again, beyond the fact that she's tough and she's independent, I wish that it integrated more into the story, and there'd be something about the canvas and the water and the boats, and it feels like kind of a throwaway experience, really.
I agree. And it also seems weird. I mean, this is a very dialogue-light film. I would say it's not a very dialogue-light film. I'd say it's a moderately dialogue-light film. And at some points, including this one, they seem to be leaning into that too heavily. Because it was unclear to me why Marianne didn't say, hey, can one of you grab that box to the 6 men in the boat who are rowing her where she's supposed to go?
And are closer to the box.
And yes, it starts out right next to the boat.
Someone could have just grabbed it.
Out of her reach, but within the reach of several of the guys in the boat.
If she had just asked.
Yeah.
Really didn't need to be a whole thing.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we won't be asking Ms. Sciamma to direct any naval combat epics in the near future. But I agree, some dialogue would have helped to both make the scene more relatable and give the audience a sense of what's going on. What are the stakes? It's not until much later that we can even put the pieces together, and something that's more smooth and fluid, I think, could have been easier to appreciate and probably would have had a stronger effect.
Yeah, and it's not that we couldn't pay any of them to speak, because one of them does give her directions to which way the house is. So we are already paying one of the guys in the boat for a speaking role. And the guys totally could have said, no, I'm not going to get that. And,
sure.
And then you can still have the action scene. But it was just weird that we're like, no, it seemed like the decision had already been made that we're going to use as little dialogue as possible in this film. And this was a case where I think sticking to that hard line did make it worse than just having them say something.
I think the no dialogue strategy is very effective in how much it evokes the isolation that these people are experiencing. Eloise is genuinely isolated as an intentional strategy put in place by her mother. They're all isolated on this remote-ish island. They have their own secrets and places where they don't fit into society. So I think it's very evocative to make the audience experience that same isolation and to show some of what it's like. To a certain extent, we have turns out 4 people living together in a big house, and that is a very silent and somewhat lonely experience. So the scenes and the portions of the story where it really is 3 or 4 people sitting around in a big house, I really liked that there wasn't not a lot of dialogue. But then when that persists, even when we go out into the world, it doesn't quite have the same connection. And I feel like that might have even been a missed opportunity to sort of draw a distinction between the isolated, unhappily alone experience that they're having from the exciting and engaging world that they, for good or for bad reasons, are blocked from.
Yeah, I agree. And if there is a category that I would like full-throatedly nominate this for an Oscar, it would be sound. And everything else I feel like it doesn't quite qualify, but I am really interested in the sound design. There is very little music, and all of it is diegetic, ? So there's only 3 instances where we hear music. There's Marianne attempting to play Verdi's Estate from the Four Seasons on the piano, which she fails at, which I actually thought was really interesting to compare to Elio's piano scene in Call Me By Your Name, because Elio is fantastic at playing the piano in a way that does in fact reference Amadeus that we've talked about earlier. So Elio is clearly an extremely accomplished pianist, and Marianne is there going like, okay, I'm going to play you this song and you're going to be so impressed. And she gets about 3 chords in and she's like, okay, and then it goes, no, sorry, it goes like this. Fuck, I don't remember.
She plays the first 30 seconds exceptionally well.
Yeah, and then
totally loses it. I felt like there was a little bit of a mismatch there.
Honestly, as someone who has tried to play the piano, extremely relatable. That was that was a moment of real relatability, that it doesn't matter how goofy their clothes look to me, that I was able to experience. So we've got that. Then we've got the Non possunt fuggire, more chant than song, sung by local women on the island. And then at the very end, we hear the Estate being played in concert.
So you referenced there the opening lines, or the lines of the song. The song has a title in French, which maybe you could share everyone the correct way to pronounce it.
The title is, I think it's just La Jeune Fille en Feu.
Jeune Fille en Feu.
Yeah, so the title of the film is Portrait de la Jeune Fille en Feu. This song is called La Jeune Fille en Feu. You can find the soundtrack to this film, and it's very interesting because it's less than 10 minutes. One of the shortest film soundtracks in existence. So, do you want me to explain what La Jeune Fille en Feu means?
Sure.
Do you
not
know
what it means? It means the young woman on fire.
So literally it translates to the young girl on fire. In French, young girl is used to refer to a much broader age range. I'm not totally confident, so don't quote me on this, but I think in French, enfant, which we would literally translate as child, is used to describe prepubescent people. And then once you hit puberty, you become a garçon, boy, or a fille, girl. So like boy and girl do not refer to 4 and 5-year-olds. They refer to like 10, 11 to 19-year-olds.
So you stop being a garçon at 19?
I mean, ish. Okay. You definitely stop being a garçon much earlier than you stop being a fille.
Got it.
I remember when I was, this would have been when I was 22, I was referred to as la jeune fille américaine, the young American girl.
By
a French woman whose house I was staying at in an Airbnb situation.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about this in terms of a Best Sound Oscar. I think sound is probably the main medium in which we're experiencing this story. Mm-hmm.
Even though it's very much about gays.
Even though it's about gays, and even though it's about paintings that we get to see, The visuals are all quite simple. No, I don't mean that as a negative way. Quite direct and not highly layered or textured. Now, of course, the sound design is also very sparse. This is a minimalist piece aesthetically. There's no way around it. But what makes this movie stand out and feel different than other movies, even other movies of the same genre, is definitely the sound design. And I think that is really what gives people the strongest impression. It doesn't have a soundtrack. It has one song which is diegetic, a few different songs that are diegetic, one of which is original and presented a few different times in the background, but it doesn't really have a soundtrack. There isn't a lot of strong sound effects. There's a lot of natural sound, a lot of wind sounds, a lot of sand sounds.
There's a lot of shoes walking on the floor. I'd say that's I want someone to count the number of words in this film and the number of times we hear a shoe hit the wooden floor. Because I don't think there's more shoes than words, but I bet this film has the closest ratio of pretty much any other film.
But yeah, I mean, no attention from the Oscars in terms of sound design and sound editing. I think there's ongoing issues with award shows in general about rewarding having more content, not necessarily having better delivered content. I wonder if the recent film, which is also so heavily based on this isolated sound design, The Zone of Interest, might be starting to change that some. And I think there's not exactly the same, but I think there is a comparison with the way that this film really centers natural sound as the focus of the story with The Zone of Interest. I think there's a similar technique there. The sound categories at that year's Oscars were dominated by Bohemian Rhapsody, which has great sound design probably because it's about music and people working in music studios.
If you can just use a lot of Queen's music, it becomes much easier to make a great soundscape.
It does.
Jumping back specifically to the Non possunt fuggire song, I refer to that as like semi-diegetic because I'm not totally sure how to interpret it. Almost everything in this film seems very realistic. We do have the sort of magical element of Marianne occasionally seeing Eloise in her wedding dress in visions where she's not actually there. But the Non possunt fuggire, so that the song is in Latin. It's being sung by a bunch of Breton women, and I could tell that it wasn't French when they were singing it. I thought it might be Breton, the language. But when I looked it up, it is in fact Latin, which, these are all Catholics going to Mass, so they probably know a little bit of Latin. But I thought it would be weird for them to be singing what appears to be an original song, an original composition in Latin. And also the music is very strange. And I'm sure that there are like indigenous music ways that are not what you would hear in classical music in these various small isolated communities around Europe. So maybe this is what Breton folk music sounds like. But I don't think so, and it is strange to me that it is in Latin. So I wasn't really sure how, like, we are looking at them singing the song. But it was weird that it seemed to be more of a sort of magical realism moment in a very realist film.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be a chant incantation. It's supposed to be, I think, very old, from probably pre-Christian or early Christian Southern Europe. And these are people who are singing the song as part of their secret nighttime women's gathering.
Yeah, you did at one point earlier imply that they were witches, which that is not how I was I mean, I don't think a working class woman in a small village automatically equals witch.
Yeah, I think the film definitely presents them as quote unquote witches. That's kind of the joke of it, to use a term, where these are the women who are meeting at night and helping people get abortions and doing things that are outside of the standard ideas of their society. And so it's, I think, intending to sort of defend the historical idea of witches and say witches are just women who do things that society doesn't approve of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do just
that I think is very
leave out the step of I just consider those. It's interesting that you say these are women who do things that society doesn't approve of. Because I think this is just women who do things that men, and largely like men who are members of the Catholic Church, don't approve of.
Well, in 18th century France, there's a lot of connection between those two things.
That's true. But there's also the other half of the population who is women. And Sophie, who is pregnant and is seeking an abortion in the film, does ask some older woman who lives on the island her advice about what to do, and then she ultimately does get an abortion from her. But Sophie, before doing that, already knows what to do. And Marianne also implies that she has had an abortion. Like, the knowledge, like, Sophie knows exactly what abortifacient herbs you need to pick, and that, like, they need to not be in flour. This is very standard knowledge. And I have to say that in general, the idea that men seem to have that women didn't know how to control their fertility before the 1960s is very funny to me.
Yeah, I think the film actively pushes against that idea. And, Sophie, I think, is in part getting the direction about how to figure these things out from these women. And again, that sort of, I don't think the film is saying, wow, these guys are magic people who are witches. I think the film is saying, this is how panic about witches, this is how it happens. There are women who have their own intellectual life, separate from the mainstream of society. They aren't following the rules of the men who are appointed as their overlords, and they do things on their own. They don't need the men to figure out their own ways. And that's what witches are. I think that's the message of the film.
Okay. Yeah, I just never then made the jump to witches. I do want to say very quickly about the abortion scene. There was a great performance in there. I cannot find the name of the actor, so I can't shout them out specifically. But there is a little baby on the bed next to Sophie while the procedure is occurring. Presumably, I mean, this is just, Sophie just goes to this woman's house, and presumably this is the woman's, like, child or grandchild who just happens to be sitting on the bed. But I wasn't sure if it was also just a, like, hey, having the abortion is gonna suck. So here's just a reminder of what you have to deal with if you don't want to have the abortion. But the kid sort of touches Sophie's face while it's happening, and it's the best performance from an under 2-year-old that I've ever seen.
Yeah, I do wonder what it would be like if, because there is a lot of just highly emotional moments of people looking at each other and sharing experiences together, and I do wonder if there was more, not necessarily action shots, but more event-based content, more stuff that happened that we got to weave in, because I feel like there's such a strong tapestry and such an effective visual language, and I just wish it connected more to itself.
One thing that I had been pointing out while we were watching the film is what pronouns our heroines are using for each other. So in French, if you don't know, there's 2 different forms of the word you, tu and vous, and tu is informal, so it means you're friends or you're talking down to someone, and vous is the formal. Our 2 heroines, even after they have had sex with each other, are using vous to talk to each other, the formal. But tu does appear in the very last line that Eloise says to Marianne. She says, retourne-toi. I think there's another word in there. But she uses toi to say, look back at me, in reference. So that is in reference to the Orpheus myth, which they had read earlier. And I actually can't remember if they read out Orpheus saying retourne-toi, or Eurydice saying retourne-toi to Orpheus, and she's using her exact language or not.
Yeah, Marianne really ends up clinging to this particular interpretation of the Orpheus story, implying that Orpheus sort of intentionally chooses to look back at Eurydice because, in her words, he prefers her as a memory and doesn't really need her around all the time, but really just wants to remember what she's like, which compares interestingly to the end of this movie, where Eloise is a memory. Marianne clearly is casting herself as the Orpheus here, and Eloise is her memory, and it seems to be unclear. Marianne doesn't seem particularly happy about it, so her defense of Orpheus seems to sort of fall flat against her own experience, and I wish the film had a statement about that. Either that Marianne was wrong and her interpretation was misguided, or that she was right.
Here's possibly one solution to the riddle, which is that Marianne sees Orpheus as aspirational, or possibly thinks that that is what Eloise has asked of her. But I agree that that is incorrect. She's like, I want to just accept this beautiful memory, of my love who is now lost to me. But it makes me really sad.
Thinking about Call Me By Your Name, I know that Andrei Ashman, the author of the original novel, has said that he thinks of Call Me By Your Name as the blueprint for an ideal relationship.
Okay,
and
Andre.
The film, of course, and the novel deals so much with the experience of heartbreak. And I think reading between the lines there, the argument is sort of that, well, in our modern world, people aren't actually going to stay together for a long-term relationship. That's something of the past. So since that's obviously impractical and no one would really do that, we all need to get comfortable and excited about having a fling, and then they break your heart, you never see them again, and that's actually great. You should like that. That should be your favorite thing. And I think that message, to some extent, is this interpretation that we're left with in Marianne's voice, even though in Call Me By Your Name, the accuracy of that claim is disputed. It's very much up to the audience to determine if this is an ideal relationship or not. Whereas Marianne is really telling us intentionally from the end of the movie, I don't like this. I wish I was more connected with this person. So there's a stronger contrast there that leaving that question unresolved presents more tension.
And now we've gotten back to the beginning of why it doesn't make sense that these two women aren't together. So I think we can stop there, and you want to move on to Call Me By Your Name?
Sure.
Call Me By Your Name is a 2017 period romance directed by a man whose name is very difficult to say. So I'm going to do it right this time, and then now you know that I know how to say it. So if I mess up later, you have to forgive me. Directed by Luca Guadagnino. Written by James Ivory of Merchant Ivory fame, based on the novel by Andrei Ashman. James Ivory, in his late 80s, is making his second ever solo screenplay. Do you know what his first solo screenplay was?
I don't know what his first... I'm going to guess Maurice.
Morris, yeah.
I don't know if he wrote that on his own, but...
Yeah, James Ivory is mostly a director. In the Merchant Ivory production company, most of the scripts were written by Ruth Prawar Jabvala, but she refused to write Morris because she wasn't going to write a screenplay about a gay couple, to which I can only assume James and Ismail said, you know that we are a gay couple, yes? I don't know how she squared that with herself.
She wanted to make more money now.
That's
Nothing
true.
personal, James.
Yeah, so they collaborated on a couple of scripts, but James Ivory is mostly just a director, and I believe was initially planning to co-direct this with Guadagnino, but he ended up just doing the screenplay. It stars Timothée Chalamet as Elio, Armie Hammer as Oliver, Michael Stuhlbarg as Mr. Perlman, who is Elio's father, Amira Kassar as Anela Perlman, Elio's mother, and Esther Garel as Marzia.
So the film Call Me By Your Name has a long history. Andrei Ashman developed the concept for the novel in 2007. He himself was all set for a big, exciting trip to Italy when, for mysterious reasons, his trip was canceled as he was sitting in the airport. And he was so upset about this that he took out his laptop in the airport and decided he was going to write a novel about someone in Italy where he wanted to be. So he wrote that opening scene of Elio sitting in his grand Italian house and watching Oliver arrive by car and feel that first feeling he felt when he saw him step out of the car there in the airport. Before the novel was even published, it was read on an early gallery by producers and was optioned as a film. Luca Guadagnino originally joined the project as a location scout once they realized it was going to be filmed in its setting in northern Italy, and Luca was one of the most well-known people in the film industry from that region, so they hired him to help them figure out how they were going to produce the individual shots. The film was in production for a long time with the plan of James Ivory writing and directing, Luca as a producer, and Shia LaBeouf starring as Elio. In 2016, Shia LaBeouf's career fell apart due to a variety of personal scandals, and investors were very hesitant to join into the project, mainly feeling like there's no story here, there's no conflict, there's nothing really happening, and so this is just going to be a boring movie about rich people sitting around looking at each other. There was also a lot of hesitance because the script that James Ivory produced was very sexually explicit and had a lot of explicit sexual content in it, and specifically mentioned the leads just showing a lot of nudity. The exact way that this happened is not clear, but because of some of these issues, James Ivory was agreed not to direct the picture, and in return was given sole authority over the script and sole screenwriting credit. It's worth noting that the final version of the film divulges significantly from James Ivory's script.
Yeah, he was not on location while they were filming. He was in New York, and occasionally they would write back to say, like, actually, we're having this problem. Can you write a new scene or a new line? And occasionally they just made up lines on set.
Principal photography was in May and June of 2017. Sorry, May and June of 2016. The film was shot on a budget of $3.5 million in Lombardy, northern Italy. It was actually filmed in the town where Luca Guadagnino lives. So he was sleeping at home during the production. There are several salacious stories involved in the production of this movie. Libby, when we watched this movie, was there any particular... When we watched this movie, Call Me By Your Name, in the theaters.
Yes.
We were watching it in Amsterdam, not the world's least progressive city, or the most easily shocked.
The Netherlands' first country to legalize gay marriage, and also the only clothing-optional country.
When we were watching this movie in the theaters, were there any particular moments that you felt like really shocked the audience?
Yes, David, there was.
Okay.
So I had read the book. So I knew exactly what was happening when I went into the theater. So I knew what to expect when we get the shot of Elio in the attic by himself with a peach next to him. He then pulls the pit out of the peach, and we can't actually see what's going on, but presumably he fucks the peach. And everyone else in the theater, I could feel stiffening their spine, although their spines is all that I can speak to. And then sort of awkwardly giggling and shuffling about in their seats in a way that they had not been doing for the rest of the film.
Yeah. People clearly felt like they're not actually gonna do this. This isn't actually gonna happen on screen. We're not gonna see anything. But
For the record, we don't see anything.
We definitely see...
He's being shot waist up.
Elio's journey from beginning to end throughout this experience.
Which I have to say is really short. I don't know what that means. Maybe it means he's a 17-year-old. Maybe this is just so erotic to him that that's why it's happening so fast. Or maybe some combination of director, producer, and actor decided that we couldn't have that long of a scene of masturbation.
Yeah. I would describe the energy of the audience as looking over their shoulder, expecting the police to come in and arrest them for this. That, I think, was basically the general feeling. People feeling like, oh, I'm complicit in a crime now, was kind of the energy that they were bringing.
I got to sit there in a feeling of haughty condescension.
You were ready. You knew this was coming.
I was like, you cowards.
So, this scene...
How did you feel? I assume you're somewhere in between me and the general audience.
I'm trying to remember if I knew that this was coming at all. If I had been told anything about this.
I don't think I would have told you.
Yeah. I mean, I knew...
But we were seeing this in the Netherlands, so it was coming out much later. I think we saw it after the Oscar season.
Yeah.
So it's possible that you had heard that this scene occurs.
I think that's the right point to highlight. So I don't know that I knew about this particular point, but I knew from conversation in film circles that there was content intended to shock. And that was part of what made the movie entertaining, for good or for bad.
For the record, I don't interpret that as content intended to shock.
Content that they knew would definitely be shocking will leave their intentions out of it. So I wasn't that surprised. I expected there to be things like that going on. And so I don't think I was that overwhelmed. Assuming I didn't know, I don't know if you had asked me to guess what would happen, I would have guessed that. I think that's... not what I would have guessed, per se.
At what point would you have guessed it?
It's a particular set of events.
We do spend a fair amount of time looking at the peach, stroking the peach, digging our fingers into the peach. Yeah, the
metaphor is firmly established. We all know what the visual...
is sort of gushing over his chest. It's a very juicy one.
So, I thought it was... We'd established our visual metaphor, and we all knew it was on Elio's mind, and the point had basically been made.
No, metaphors are for cowards.
But no, this is not a metaphor. We are going to get into it. So we did. So yeah, this part, both in the original novel and in the film, has received a lot of attention. You know, we talked about what's your high action point for the movie. That's at what point in the movie will the typical audience member's heart be pumping the fastest? It's probably then. It's something to observe. So when Mr. Guadagnino was originally adapting the film, he strongly believed he did not want to include this sequence. Not because it was too scandalous, but because he thought it was totally unrealistic and ridiculous. And he was like, okay, I get we want to establish this visual metaphor and this concept of it, but, you know, I want to present a film about real humans doing real human things. And he told this to the author, Mr. Othniman, and Mr. Othniman said, you should try it. So he did. And he was thus convinced that it was actually quite realistic and chose to include it in the movie. It's worth noting that Timothée Chalamet...
It is pronounced Timothy, actually.
Thank you. Timothée Chalamet, he also agreed to do the role, but said, I don't want to do the part with the peach. Not because, you know, I'm a prude, but just because that's ridiculous. So Luca said to him, you should try it. And so he did. He was thus convinced and agreed to include it in the film. So that's part of the story. The film was largely filmed in chronological order, which I actually think, you know, a lot of people would... sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes it's great. Obviously, more convenient. A little bit easier for everybody.
Yeah, most of it is shot at this one house.
That choice is often, choosing to shoot a film in chronological order is often for good reason, looked down on and sort of considered, so you weren't intellectually or technically mature enough to do the movie the right way, so you had to do it in the correct order. I think so much about what makes the film as good as it is that it is filmed in chronological order, and that the audience and the actors are going through the same experience. And I think there's a couple points to note there. Maybe the second or first most talked about part of the movie is the speech from Mr. Perlman at the end. The "I love you no matter who you are" speech, or however we want to phrase it.
The "I am also bi" speech.
Yes,
that's the we already know that his parents know about this and are pretty accepting. But the "I am also bi" is the revelation in that speech. There was actually some conflict between Guadagnino and Ivory about whether mom knows or not. So in the book, there's enough context. The book is told first person from Elio's perspective, and we get a lot of his internal monologue. When Elio asks his father, does mom know? Given all of the context of what Elio's thinking about, it's clear that he's asking, does mom know that Oliver and I are in love or hooked up or whatever? But in the context of the film, where we don't have all that, it's unclear whether he's asking, does mom know that you, dad, or bi, or does mom know about me and Oliver? James Ivory said, obviously the answer is Elio and Oliver, because he's read the book. But I think that's not completely clear in the film, and Mr. Perlman's response is, no, she doesn't. And James Ivory said he's lying because he wants to spare his son the embarrassment. I had assumed, watching the film, that, having not remembered all of the elements of the book, that given how obvious it is that mom knows about Olio and Oliver, you get it.
Call me by our names.
Call me by our ship name. They're almost aglio olio, which is a way of preparing pasta. Yeah, so given how obvious it is from Ms. Cassar's performance that she does in fact know, I figured the only thing that question could be referring to is, does mom know that you are bisexual? And in Ivory's original script, he broke with Asimhan's novel and had mom know in the text that it's going on. And Guadagnino didn't like this, so he changed it. But I think Amira Cassar must have gotten a little whisper from James Ivory, or saw an earlier version of the script before that change, or maybe just had her own ideas about the character, because the way she's playing it is very aware. She's got these like knowing glances when her son comes down after their first night of lovemaking.
Yeah, it seems clear that the mom knows, the dad knows, the mom knows, and he's telling Elio no to shield his feelings. I think that's definitely the impression I got watching the cinematography.
Okay. Yeah, I interpreted it as Elio is asking, does mom know that you are bi? And he is saying, I don't think so.
Yeah, this was actually one of the key points of tension again with the investors. The investors really wanted the mom to be the bad guy. They were like, we can save this movie. This movie has no tension, no conflict. Let's have the mom be kind of homophobic and conservative. And then it's Elio and his dad versus the mom. That's a movie. Now we got a story. So this speech, which I guess is the climax of the movie, was filmed on the second to last day of shooting. And I think that went a long way to why, it's an effective scene. It's quoting straight from the book, and the speech in the book is much, much longer. But a lot of the excitement comes not just from the speech itself, but people are very excited about Mr. Perlman's performance and how engaging and immersive and natural it seems. And I think this goes a lot from this person has basically watched the events of this movie play out in front of them as an actor over the last however many few weeks. And so they are able to actually talk about their own experience working on the project. The film was released in January 2017 at Sundance. I think one thing that stands out at the movie financially is we were not the only people that saw it after it got nominated from the Oscar, or after it won from the awards. Before the awards, it was out for quite a while, and it made about $9.5 million. And then in the period between the nominations being announced and the award show itself, it made another $7.5 million. And I would say it was the Oscar nomination, which, though it had certainly been received well, I don't know that was really a lock for this film when they came out that elevated this movie. And I think it would have been largely forgotten and more or less ignored if it weren't for the Oscar nomination for Best Picture. And it ended up with a 94% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a 7.8 on IMDb with about 322,000 votes. It did receive a lot of attention from the major awards. It was nominated for Best Picture. Timothée Chalamet was also nominated for Best Actor, lost to Gary Oldman's Winston Churchill. It did win for Best Adapted Screenplay. It's James Ivory is the oldest Oscar winner, or competitive Oscar winner, at 89.
The film was in production for so long, though, that I think he actually did the work many years before.
That's right. It was also nominated for Best Picture at the BAFTAs, also nominated there for Best Direction and Best Actor. Timothée Chalamet was nominated for the Rising Star Award, but lost to Daniel Kaluuya. And James Ivory won again for Best Adapted Screenplay. Originally, there was a lot of momentum that there was going to be a sequel to Call Me By Your Name. There's a sequel book, Find Me. You probably
I haven't read it
understand
because it sounds bad.
It's not been received very well. So then Guadagnino said, well, don't worry, we're still going to do a sequel, but we're not going to base it on Find Me. You guys didn't like that. So he said originally he was waiting for the sequel until the book sequel came out. That didn't really pan out. So then he said, all right, I'm going to go make my own sequel, basically. Don't worry, me and James, or maybe not James, we don't necessarily get along anymore. I'll figure it out. So there was a lot of an idea. It was maybe going to be a 2020 production. But then when Armie Hammer faced his own array of
sexual assault allegations
issues, I'll just leave
the personal issues that he assaults people.
I won't even get into all of the very salacious details about that, but it's very Googleable. And that basically ended all momentum, and there's not going to be a sequel. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I'm also not surprised that the sequel novel was not well received, because although it's not in the film, the novel does have an epilogue where we see them 15 and then 20 years later. And they kind of say hi. Elio decides that he doesn't want to meet Oliver's family because he's still kind of jealous of them. But it's actually just pretty sad.
That's the ideal relationship, Libby. So you're still stuck in this. Well, Andre will explain it to you.
Thanks, Andre.
Yeah.
For people who don't know us personally, David and I are high school sweethearts, fell in love as teenagers, and have recently celebrated our 10th anniversary. So we're actually, I know it's controversial to say this, but we actually believe that you can find the one when you're a teenager.
See, I have the quote right here. When someone asked him, I think the question was, what is your goal for this book? What do you want to come out of it? Asimon. He said, it should serve as a model for a happy romance.
Yeah, I mean, it's happy up until the part where Oliver says, actually, I'm going to marry somebody else. There is a lot of happiness in it. And, if sometimes at the end of the summer he has to leave, but then you find each other again later, that's fine. But Elio just gets rejected at the end. I
think it's interesting that, he does get cold dropped. I think it's interesting that Andre himself has been married for many years. And is still married now, many years after this film was produced.
Well, apparently she's the wrong one. Sorry, Mrs. Asimov.
He's also said that he did have his own Oliver. So I think there's a lot of reason to think that this is actually a pretty autobiographical story. I guess the last thing I'll mention about the reception is that the film has faced significant controversy for the way it portrays the relationship of people of different ages. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the discussion, I think now, several years after the movie has come out, is still focused on that question. Maybe one of the most outspoken there is Karama Brown, who is a therapist who is most famous for being one of the hosts of the new Queer Eye show. His quote, I'll read it, it says, "It looks like a grown man having sex with a little boy. And for me, I was just not okay with that. There's predatory behavior that I see. If that was an older man who looked that much older with a 16 or 17-year-old girl, we would all have a hissy fit. We would have recognized that this is a problem, but for some reason, because it was two men, we're just like, oh, well, this is exploration."
Yeah, I didn't really have that feeling watching the film because I had read the book first. So in the book, Elio is 17 and Oliver is 24. He is a graduate student. Armie Hammer, although he's technically playing a 24-year-old, does look like he's 31, and they never say that he's 24. And I think maybe if they had put that in the text, that might have helped people. Because what's going on... And also, Timothy is obviously not 17. He was 21 or 22.
Yeah, he's a very young looking person.
Yeah,
that's the bit with Timothy.
Timothy's a 21-year-old who looks like he's 17, and Armie Hammer is a 31-year-old who looks like he's 31. I will point out that people in the 80s did actually look older than, like, they smoked a lot of cigarettes, and it does make you look older. But what it looks like is an adult man having sex with a teenager. And that's not great.
Yeah, I don't think it was any accident that this visual impression is given. I think the film is intended to titillate the people who find that titillating and shock the people who find that shocking. And I don't think it was like, oh, it's an accident that we brought in Armie Hammer and he looks way older and Timothy kind of looks like a kid. I think that was their strategy for selling the movie. It's also worth noting that maybe the second biggest controversy coming out is that there's been a lot of pushback from James Ivory. Specifically, James Ivory is pretty upset that the sexual content and the nudity was toned down. I think he was offended at the most intense love scene that we're a part of, that the camera pans and looks out the window.
Well, the most intense love scene between Elio and Oliver, whereas he
That's
pointed
true.
out that we get arguably a more explicit scene between Elio and Marzia.
Yeah, and Guadagnino himself, I think partially because he's heard so much of the pushback from James, has referred to that as a McCarthy-era technique. That's Luca's words there, to pan the camera out of the window. I think he sort of intended it as he spun it off as an artsy statement. But let's remember that one of the big reasons James was basically kicked off of the project at the beginning is because the investors weren't happy with all of the naked men's. Mm-hmm. And I think we can reasonably conclude that Luca agreed to play ball and James didn't. And that's why Luca got the job and James didn't. And
yeah, I will say the sexual content is very much in the book. I would say James Ivory's other solo screenplay, Morris, does have full frontal nudity. It does not depict, it only extremely briefly depicts sexual acts. But Morris, the novel, also has a lot less sex in it. So I would say we are not seeing the same ratio of page sex to screen sex between Morris as we see in Call Me By Your Name.
Yeah, I think the impression Ivory gives was that he was very excited. And he was like, okay, now we have this gay novel that everyone's so excited about. It's going to be a big movie. This is the chance to push through and have explicit gay sex on screen. Now we're finally going to do it. And then he was sort of pulled along on that rope, and then it was stolen away from him at the last second. For a while, Lucas said that he just didn't feel like nudity was appropriate, and he'd never thought about it. He always thought that it was going to be a pretty tame by those standards film, and no big deal. A quote from James, he says, "When Lucas says he never thought of putting nudity in, that is totally untrue. He sat in my room where I am sitting now, talking about how he would do it. So when he says that it was a conscious aesthetic decision not to, well, that's just bullshit."
Yeah, and there are a couple of butts in Call Me by Your Name and Marzia's breasts. But we do not get any actual genitals. I will point out we do briefly, in a non-sexual context, get genitals in Portrait of a Lady on Fire.
Yeah, very different type of scene.
Yeah, and I think James Ivory was sort of pointing this out as an American versus European sensibilities issue, where Europeans are very relaxed about nudity and Americans are prudes. And the nudity and sexual acts in Morris are very much not sensationalized.
Not at all. That's, I think, one of the most tasteful films in its depiction of relatively explicit sexual activity that exists.
Yeah, one of the least exciting penises ever shown on screen.
Well, I have the quote that you're referencing from Ivory here, because both actors had in their contracts that they were not going to do full frontal nudity. And those contracts were signed right after Ivory had left the production and sold the script to Guadagnino's company, so now it's Guadagnino's project. And before while the official plan was that there was going to be this nudity, they signed these actors with clauses saying there wasn't going to be nudity. So at that point, James kind of knew what was going on. He says, it's an American attitude. Nobody seems to care that much about a totally naked woman. This is something that must be so deeply cultural that one should ask why.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell him the answer why, and that is that female genitals are internal, whereas male genitals are external. I think that is why. I think that's part of the reason why I think also women are generally more sexualized, and it is less sensational to see them in a sexual context.
After Ivory's pushback became public, Guadagnino in an interview said, "The truth of the matter is I had absolute control and I made the movie the way I wanted. There's a great song by Prefab Spout that says, 'All the world loves lovers. All the world loves people in love.' It does not say, 'All the world loves lovers' cocks, and all the world loves people's cocks in love.' Why do people want to see other people's penises?" And then he looked at the interviewer and said, "Did you miss the penises?" So that's what he has to say.
Yeah, on that topic, I will say, I don't think that this is a problem in this film. But I have definitely seen movies where I'm like, in real life, the characters would be naked while this scene was occurring. And they are very clearly only wearing, bathrobes or pajamas or tastefully arranged sheets because they're trying to keep it at an R rating or even a PG-13 rating. And that doesn't mean you need to include genitals in the shot, but I guess I'm siding with Ivory here that obviously there are times when people are naked in real life, and I'm not the one who decided to depict those moments in film. Other people are deciding to pick those moments in film, but then artificially clothe them.
How did you feel about the window pan?
I was fine with the window pan because it seemed like we were about to actually have a sexual act.
And that's right out?
I mean, I'm not going to ask actors to engage in sexual acts on camera. Although I do think it's really notable that the window pan happens there for the gay love scene, but not the straight love scene.
Yeah, it was interesting. The straight love scene is sort of strategically shot where the actors are in the bottom right-hand corner of the frame, and we're really only seeing their head and their shoulders.
And breasts are in the straight love scene. Yes?
Is that in the love scene? I think that's in the aftermath of the
love
scene.
Well, first they have sex and she's wearing a dress and she's sort of pulled it up. And then later she's in a bikini, takes off the bikini top, and presumably eating out happens. But mainly just kissing hip bones.
Yeah, I'm specifically here referring to the one where they're in the fields at night.
Okay.
Where the most conventional sexual activity occurs. And
yeah, I was referring to the scene with
breasts. True. That's true.
Yeah, and also Luca has firmly said breasts are okay, penises are not.
Got it. Well, next controversy would be there's a lot of pushback about the fact that this is a movie about gay people, whereas both of the lead actors are not openly gay. That's something that's not true for Portrait of a Lady, where the director and the star of the film actually had a sexual relationship, and that's part of the story of the film itself. So I'm very interested in your thoughts. I'll just read Guadagnino's response there, where he says, "This is a jarring question. Are you going to have a serial killer playing a serial killer? Are you only going to cast astronauts in Apollo 13? The idea that you have to cast only someone who has a certain set of skills, and worse, a certain gender identity in any role, that's oppressive to me. I don't ask my cast, are you gay or not? Yes, Army is married, and he's a wonderful husband and father. But who knows where his desires lie? Also, Luca, we now know where his desires lie. So, good news.
I would also describe him as not a wonderful husband and father.
Also, they may not be what you expect. When you find out, you're gonna be surprised. I'm not gonna be the one to question him. Imagine if Rock Hudson was not cast as a love interest. I love those movies, and I love and believe in the romance between him and his leading ladies. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that quote.
Yeah. So I think I want to first indicate that this discussion about gender or about sexual orientation is different than a discussion about race or potentially gender, because we don't know what someone's sexual orientation is. I believe it is Kate Winslet has said, I know for a fact that there are multiple men in Hollywood, actors, who are bisexual but in straight passing relationships and are not going to come out because it would damage their career. There's also, do you know who Becky Albertalli is?
I don't know that name.
She's an author. She wrote a book, Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda. It was adapted into the film Love, Simon. It's about a gay teenager. And she had to deal with a lot of really disgusting abuse about capitalizing on queer love when she herself is straight. This forced her to come out as bisexual. So I'm totally fine if you want to say, why didn't you cast a black actor in this role that is supposed to be black? But I think it is impossible to say, why didn't you cast a gay or lesbian or bisexual actor in this gay, lesbian, or bisexual role? Because that's just not information that we know.
It's interesting, in my mind, how uncharismatic Elio is as a character. Mm-hmm. And it really leaves me wondering, other than the fact that he's supposed to be good looking and useful, what is it that Army finds attractive about this person? And I'm frankly left to conclude that the answer is nothing. Mm-hmm. And that I think from...
Interestingly, I was watching an interview with James Ivory, and someone asked the exact opposite question. They said, Oliver just doesn't seem that attractive. Why is Elio interested in him?
Yeah, I don't think either of these people seem like a good person to be in a relationship with at all. And it turns out they're not a good person to be in a relationship with. And in my mind, this is a story about people that just find each other physically attractive and enjoy each other's company fine. I mean, they're both supposed to be very, intelligent people. Elio's very talented at some of the things that he's doing. And Oliver is, supposed to be good at research. We have this special scene to see how knowledgeable he is about philology, in part to sort of show how old and mature he is, to draw the distinction with Elio. But throughout the movie...
Well, I think Elio is also being portrayed as smart. Like, he's a genius on the piano.
Yes.
And I don't think we can say Elio is being portrayed as smart, but that doesn't have any impact on indicating his maturity. And Oliver is portrayed as smart, and that means that he's mature.
No, I think that's very fair. Throughout the movie, I think both of these people are really rude and selfish, self-centered, and are very flippant with other people's feelings. There's this moment where Elio is walking through, he's having a nosebleed, and he's looking for some ice, and he looks in a fridge, and he doesn't have what he wants, so he just kind of walks away and doesn't really close the door. And his maid has to come up behind him and clean up behind him. And this really stood out to me. Again,
I mean, to defend that moment, he's in the middle of a nosebleed. Okay. She tells him there's ice in the fridge. There isn't ice in the fridge, so he goes to a different fridge to get ice. Like, and he doesn't leave. He attempts to close the door, and it doesn't close personally. This is also a personal issue for me, because my mom's fridge is very difficult to close. My mom's freezer is very difficult to close, and I have been yelled at on multiple occasions for not perfectly closing the freezer. Yeah. So I give Elio a pass on this one.
Fine.
Especially mid-nosebleed, you're allowed to mess up closing the freezer.
Even if beyond him just being rude and selfish, he also is, I feel like, intentionally, I guess to kind of go back to some of the controversy about the age gap, it seems like he's really portrayed in this movie as a child and as a very childish person. He's cuddling with his parents on the couch and...
I actually think that's a more of a like European thing. Europeans are more physically affectionate than Americans.
That's true. I mean, Elio is not a European. He is an American. He's lived in Europe for a while. I'm sure his family are of a European background.
I think he lives in Europe like 5 months out of the year every year.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the book does actually explain his travel history more.
They clearly are going there every summer. It's actually unclear if they do in fact live in the United States. Mm-hmm. We know that this house they're at is their summer house, and they also go there for the winter holidays. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's established in the book, but certainly not in the film. It's possible that his dad works at an Italian university, and so like they spend the spring and fall in Rome or Naples or something, and this is their country house.
But yeah, his mannerisms, his way of dressing and carrying himself is very childish. It's very immature. So I didn't really understand why Oliver was into Elio. And to play it on the other side, since you brought it up, Oliver is such a boring person. Mm-hmm. And he has it seems like so little going on internally beyond just satisfying his moment-to-moment needs. And, there's a sequence where I can't remember what level of sexual activity has just occurred, but where Oliver kind of walks into a room after that and kind of to the camera, but more or less to the wall, is like, wow, what was, that sure was something. And I'm not sure if it's that Oliver is a very boring person, or maybe Armie Hammer wasn't bringing a lot of acting juice to that scene, but he just spends most of the time with this very blank, meaningless grin, including in the intimate moments where it's not some show he's putting on for other people. So, I mean, again, maybe that's intentional. Maybe Asaman's point is that the ideal romance is a maybe kind of creepy, purely physical relationship that you have in your teens and then look back on in a wistful way. But it doesn't really seem like there's any connection between these people beyond the purely physical.
Yeah. So I'll say, as someone who's read the book,
the
book is very much first person from Elio's perspective. We don't really know what Oliver is thinking. That's part of the book. Like you need to interpret Elio as the main character of the story. This is not...
I wouldn't say that the film is heavily in that way. It seems like a two lead.
Yeah, so like part of the intrigue of the book is that we don't know what Oliver is thinking almost all the time.
Okay.
Because I had that background, I was fine with that angle of the book, or with that angle in the film. Mm-hmm. As for Elio, like why does Elio find Oliver attractive? I mean, it's been a while since I've read the book, so I can't remember all of the exact moments. I think one answer is that mainly what's happening is Elio is figuring out that he's bisexual and just wants to have sex with a man, and Oliver is hot, there, and willing. And there's worse reasons to have sex with someone.
It's true.
Yeah, I did notice that like the film was very good, and this is also in the book, at like realistically capturing the awkwardness of early attraction. So I believe it's the day that Oliver has arrived, or maybe it's the next morning. Elio offers to show him around town, so they take their bikes into town, do something, and then get back on their bikes, which are positioned next to each other. And we can't even really see it because Timothy is hidden behind Armie. But he says, "Oh, sorry," as though he's like bumped into him on the bike. And I 100% interpreted that as Elio has come up with some reason to touch Oliver and is just playing it off as I slipped getting onto my bike.
Classic. Yeah, I think the answer the film wants to give to why are they attracted is focused on their Jewish identity. And
that's actually even bigger in the book. Elio thinks it's super hot that Oliver is Jewish.
Yeah, Oliver is not only is Jewish, but he wears a Star of David necklace. And, Elio has had to hear his mother say these probably very painful things about how they're supposed to be Jews of discretion, I believe is her term. And, that I could certainly understand why that would be very liberating to find someone who's not afraid to say who they are and is not ashamed of their background. And, Oliver lives in America, not in Italy, where there is more anti-Semitism in America. So it's a little bit easier for Oliver to be casual about being proud of his Jewishness than it is for Elio. I think that's a factor. But, I can see how maybe from that side there is a connection. And, Elio is a very young and immature person. So to some extent, his interest in Oliver is, as you point out, very explainable. Oliver's relationship with Elio, I can't explain. And I don't feel... I think we can explain it by the fact that Oliver doesn't want to be with Elio for the long time. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm on the side, which apparently the novel is very ambiguous, that Oliver is not really in love with Elio. And Oliver is using Elio, and Elio is going to regret this later. Mm-hmm. I don't know that this is what it says in the sequel. You know, I don't know anything about the sequel, but that's the impression that we get from the events we know. Andre Rashomon does have a cameo in this movie.
Oh, yes.
Now, you know a little bit of what it looks like, so do you know where his cameo is?
I definitely did when I watched it the first time. But at this point, I can't remember.
I was paying careful attention when we watched it for the podcast, and you didn't seem to have any recognition. Okay. He is one of the gay couple that comes to visit and have dinner with them that Elio is kind of making fun of a little bit. He's the shorter one.
He's the one who does less talking.
The one who does less talking, yes.
His English isn't great.
Guadagnino said he did a great job. The editor of the film also makes an appearance. I know you don't know what the editor looks like.
Not.
He is... Any guess at where he is in the film?
Is he also in a couple... Is he one of those couple who talk until Elio's mother has to say, Americano?
Oh, the old couple.
Yes.
I believe that's her parents. I could be wrong about that.
Oh, no. I thought...
No. It's just neighbors?
I thought those were just neighbors.
Okay, I wasn't sure how to interpret that. No, he's much younger than those people. He is the DJ at the discotheque.
Oh, I don't even remember seeing a shot of him.
Well, he's in there.
Was he a live DJing?
Yes, he was the one DJing. Well, I don't know. Was he live DJing? I have no idea.
Okay.
Probably not. I doubt there was any music playing at all in that scene.
I feel like there's crossover between...
Sure, it's quite possible. I bet he's done it.
DJing and film editing.
Andre's cameo was totally improvised. He just happened to be visiting the set around that time, and the actor wasn't available at the last minute.
Oh.
So they said, hey, you want to be in the movie? He didn't want to do it, but I think he did a good job. One thing I love about the ending of the movie is that they play the credits over content. And not only do I like this because, I guess we're efficient, but I feel like this is a dramatically underused technique. And of course, in the superhero franchises, the post-credit scenes has become really prized, which is a nice technique. But I think watching the credits of a movie, are something that an audience has a really strong connection with. This is the ending of the story. Now we have this moment where we stop and experience the ending for a long time. And this is such a powerful tool to integrate into your story. And I thought very effectively here. So I was glad to see that happen. And I think directors should... I think that's kind of the idea that's a bit cheap, maybe a bit pop to do it that way. But I think directors should do so happily.
Yeah, I thought it was a really striking and beautiful ending. A little bit difficult to do practically because you have to time it. But the main reason I can think of why people wouldn't do it is that the movie theaters don't know what to do with it. So in our theater, once the credits started rolling, they turned the lights up and people started to leave.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Which just really ruined it for me.
Yeah, it's tricky. I don't... That didn't ruin it for me.
Okay.
I think that's the point for me, and I'm okay with it being played both ways. I mean, maybe some people are bored. They got stuff to do. And the movie is actually over now. You can leave. It's fine.
You can leave, but you can walk out of a movie anytime you want. But there is a level of courtesy that you extend to the other people watching the movie while it is still playing. And if the lights are down, that once the lights come up, disappears.
Yeah, we need to be able to raise the floor lights without turning on the overhead lights.
Do you think at the ending of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, we have an extended shot of Eloise crying to Lestate?
Are the credits rolling while this is happening?
They are not rolling.
All right.
So it's just a long shot which very slowly pulls in on Eloise as she cries listening to Estate. And then we cut to black and get the credits. Would you have preferred to see the credits while the shot was continuing?
I could be wrong. I think in this case the answer is no.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that makes a lot of sense, partially because, unlike in Call Me By Your Name, what we have to walk away from this moment with is a sense of finality. The point is that this is the end. It doesn't get better than this. Whereas in Call Me By Your Name, the point is, could it get better? Now anything could happen. Leaving it open for a sequel to some extent. And so I think in Call Me By Your Name, having it over the credits gives us the right emotional effect, and that would have been the wrong emotional effect to take from Portrait of a Lady on Fire. So No, I think it was probably the right choice.
Yeah, I agree, but given that you came out so strongly with it being good and Call Me By Your Name, I was wondering if you would disagree.
It should be in consideration. It should definitely be on the table as a choice. And if someone chose to do that, we shouldn't say that's definitely the wrong choice. But I don't think it needed to happen there.
Yeah, this did trigger a memory of another complaint I had about the production design of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which is that clearly time is passing. Eloise has a child who is at least 5 in the painting, but plausibly like 8 or 9.
Yeah.
No work is done to show the passing of time in the character design or in any of it. So we don't put old makeup on either of our leads. We don't put gray in their hair. Their hairstyles and the dress styles are the same. And I'm like, is this like a year later? Because that's what it feels like. And that also means you have so much more of your life. Like, it seems like Marianne is, let's say, 30 when she paints the painting. Maybe the epilogue section.
She's probably younger than that.
Yeah. Maybe the epilogue. I'm trying to be generous.
Yeah.
Maybe the epilogue section is happening 5 years later.
Minimum.
Based on how it looks.
Minimum.
So she's 35.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense to be like, that's the last time I saw her and I never saw her again. When I'm like, you're halfway through your life.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the Portrait of a Lady is that the leads are too old. Mm-hmm. And their behavior and their the way that that during the course of the plot and especially at the end, they're acting like they're thinking about a relationship they had when they were high school, when they were late teenagers. I don't know. I think it's possible that those are the relationships that the director and writer and actors are thinking about their youthful relationships in a time where being a lesbian was a much harder thing to do and would maybe more fit with the experience shown in the film. And in a lot of ways, they don't act like the adults, and they're kind of trying to play it on both sides, where we want to really respect their maturity in making adult decisions, but then their patterns of behavior are more like that of a teenager. And I think they intentionally aren't aging them up because they want it to be sort of aspirational for the audience, and to give the audience a sense of like, hey, it's so sad that they can't get together now. You know, they're still just as hot. It would be great. It's not like they both maybe have moved on. And this is, again, the sort of, we're definitely left with the impression that Eloise is just as secretly obsessed with Marianne, and their feelings are totally reciprocal. But there are so many clues, and this seems like just another one, that Eloise maybe is more happy with her family and her life now, and is less obsessed with getting back with Marianne.
I didn't get that, because she's like crying.
Yeah.
So when I was watching the final shot, the line that was recalled to me was something along the lines of, so you're saying, de temps en temps je serai consolée. Did you get that?
I did not.
Okay. Maybe you remembered it when she said it.
Fair enough.
So this is pretty early in the film, before the romance has really begun. They're talking about Eloise's marriage. Marianne is trying to make her feel better about it and says like, hey, you'll be going to Milan, and in Milan they have music, right, and you liked it when I played the either harpsichord or clavichord. Someone with more knowledge, please let me know. So, you'll be able to enjoy music in Milan. And Eloise says, so what you're saying is, from time to time, I shall be consoled? Mm-hmm. So I was like, okay, this is a moment where she's being consoled, because she needs it. Mm-hmm. So I definitely interpreted Eloise as sad in her current life.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. I think that's very much the impression that we're given. I just think the film is trying to play it both ways there.
Talking about what is the right order, this is the first time that I feel like it really doesn't matter what order you watch these movies in. I feel
like you've said that before, but okay.
Oh.
Maybe I'm wrong.
I've occasionally said there are arguments to watch it in this order, and there are arguments to watch it in this order.
But definitionally ambiguous.
Yeah, I feel like it's truly ambiguous. They were made only 2 years apart. Honestly, it's spoiling my next idea before you have a chance to respond to this one. My apologies. I am wondering if these films are actually too similar to be an effective double feature.
I think that's not true because the endings are so subtly different.
Okay.
I think that it makes actually a great double feature because in both cases, they both end with this crying into the camera. But in the case of Portrait of a Lady, it's so definitionally sad and terrible. This is now a tragic story. And I feel like there's some tension with that really tragic direction with some of the story elements and the production elements, but that the film takes a hard stance on that. Whereas in Call Me By Your Name, we have a very similar set of plots, all things considered, and I do see where you're coming from there, but even though the same events are effectively happening at the ending, the film's own interpretation and the cultural interpretation has been so different that maybe this is actually an uplifting story about, according to the original author, the perfect relationship.
Okay, I don't think a lot of people see that, but...
that's all I could think about watching the movie, personally.
All you could think about was that this is the perfect relationship?
Yes. All I could think about watching the movie was like, okay, so this is the perfect relationship. Okay, here it is.
According to Asaman.
Yes.
I don't think a lot of people I don't think most people have read that quote. And I don't think that anyone who hasn't read that quote will come out of the movie going like, that relationship was perfect. No notes.
It's interesting because, though not quite in those words, there is to some extent the message that Mr. Perlman gives at the end. He says, it's great what you had, and I never had that, and you should be happy about it, is basically what he said. You can feel sad about it, that's fine, you can feel sad about it, but actually this is great, and everything's going to be great, in the big picture, this is great.
Yeah. I think Mr. Perlman uses an awful lot of very beautiful words to say, it's better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all. That statement does not mean that it's not best to love and you keep loving and you're happy.
You're going to have to take that up with Andre. Again,
I very strongly disagree with Andre, and I will fight you.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of similarity, but this difference, which is the key for both stories, in Portrait of a Lady, is it better to have loved and lost and never lost at all? I don't know that we even quite get that far. I think it's a bit too tragic to answer that question with a strong affirmative. So in Call Me By Your Name, we decide that this set of circumstances, the way we should interpret it is, actually, this is great. Whereas in Portrait of a Lady, the interpretation is very much the opposite. And once you know that, looking back to the rest of the movie forces you to question, are these the same movies or are they not? Because if they're the same movie, they should have, shall we say, the same moral. But their creators don't seem to agree with you. Okay,
so do you think one of them should go first in a double feature?
I agree. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm going to have to think about it for a second. But yeah, so okay, which one is better?
So here's some other points in common that I listed. So you can see if that influences what your answer might be. So we have this sort of frustrating episode at a piano or either harpsichord or clavichord. In Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Marianne is trying to play Lestate, fails, and then over an hour later, at the end of the film, we finally get the conclusion to that scene where we hear Estate in concert, which she said is how you really want to hear it.
Not anything from the operas about Orpheus. I just got to throw that out there. Seems like a weird choice, honestly.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It's not like that's a famously romantic piece or a particularly unique piece. It's one of the most cliched. I don't mean that as an insult, but okay, Vivaldi, it's a nice song.
Vivaldi, you basic.
Okay.
I love Vivaldi. So I will get into this since you brought it up.
Yeah.
So when watching the film, I was like, what music is that playing at the very end? I didn't immediately recognize it. Because I'm mostly an opera person, not any other type of classical music person. I have to say, to me, it is fascinating that book people, movie people, musical theater people, and opera/ballet people are so siloed, because I feel like I'm interested in all of these media.
We're working on it. We have a whole podcast. We're doing it.
And I just want to let you know, if you really enjoy movies, I think you would enjoy opera. There's lots of bad operas out there.
There's a lot of operas and the varying qualities. That's fair.
But there's also lots of good operas. So I'll leave a link to a really interesting production of Gluck's Orfeo et Eurydice.
If you like cinema, you're going to like this production. Yeah. That's what I have to say about that. If you're a cinema fan, even if you turn the sound off, which you shouldn't, you should still watch this. Yeah. It's amazing visuals.
I told you that I was really mad that once I figured out they were doing Vivaldi's Estate, that they made the wrong choice. Because obviously, this shouldn't be a performance of the Four Seasons, which I don't think you ever start with Estate. But whatever.
The famous bit.
I mean, lots of Inverno are also famous. But it should have been the overture to Gluck's Orpheus and Eurydice.
Yeah, it should have been.
because they read the story of Orpheus and Eurydice and sort of debate about whether...
It's like a big part of the movie.
Yeah, they debate about whether it was good or whether it's like a good story for Orpheus to turn around. The painting that Marianne is exhibiting is of Orpheus turning around, appearing to say goodbye to Eurydice.
Orpheus said, Eurydice, it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. Bye.
And also, let me check when The Four Seasons was composed. Okay, The Four Seasons, fun fact, is also a hotel, and it's a crime that Google gives that to me as the top option when obviously
It's a pretty bad name for a hotel.
Yeah, I don't want to stay there for 4 seasons.
It's like, okay, I don't know, what are you selling here?
I'd much prefer 1 solid week.
Is there snow inside the hotel? Is that where this is going?
Four Seasons were published in 1725, which, any way you slice it,
it's a long way.
It is way earlier than this film, especially the epilogue, can be taking place.
I mean, I think of Vivaldi as someone who was popular at his time, but really came to be a big name more in the 19th century than in the 18th century. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people think of like all of classical music was happening at the same time, and there weren't really like trends. So like people, classical musicians from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century are all being played now. This is less so the case in the 18th century. And also, I think certain composers from all 5 of those centuries are very popular now. But there are also definitely trends in what modern people like to listen to in their classical music. So I think it's very strange that, this decades-old piece is being performed when Gluck's opera, Orpheus and Eurydice, is staring right at you. It premiered in Vienna in 1762. And it premiered in Paris with a French libretto in 1774, which is a very plausible closing year. Also, one thing that it would give you for people who actually know Gluck's opera is that unusually Gluck's opera has a happy ending. Cupid shows up at the end and says, "Hey, Orfeo, this was all a test, and we actually knew that you would fail."
It's a nice ending.
So we're just going to bring your wife back to life anyway, have fun. So this is kind of the one happy ending version of Orpheus. And for people who do know that, it does give you like a long-term, hopeful view on these taboo relationships, whether it be between 2 women or between a man and a dead woman. But to actually get back to my point, so I was also mad because they brought up Orpheus so much, but then didn't resolve it. And I didn't realize that Estate was what Marianne had been playing on the piano. So I think it actually is, like, story-wise, it's okay to have the setup of Estate, which we finally pay off at the very end with it being performed in concert. And the Orpheus section does get resolved because Marianne's last words are, "Look back at me." Or sorry, Eloise's last words are, "Look back at me." And Marianne does turn to look at her, and she's in her wedding dress, symbolizing that she is lost to her. But just from like a historical accuracy perspective, they're way more likely to be at the Gluck opera than at Vivaldi's Four Seasons.
Well, the Vivaldi piece doesn't really have anything to do with the emotional experience that the characters are having or the artistic elements of the piece. So it's a nice song, and it is referenced early on in the story, but you would think you might want to pick something that integrates with the story, and they did.
Yeah, I thought one thing that would have made Estate so much more appropriate was if we had clearly established this film as taking place during the summer. Like, I genuinely couldn't tell what season it was. It seems to not be winter, but I probably would have guessed it was spring.
I think it's March. Yeah, I think it's pretty clearly March. I could be wrong, but it looks like March.
Like whenever anyone goes into the water, it seems like they're quite cold.
Yeah.
So, like, if this had been really firmly established that it was taking place in summer, as Call Me By Your Name was, it's clearly a summer story, then I might be more willing to accept that, like, she's listening to the sounds. Vivaldi is so effectively conjuring the sounds of summer that it is reminding her of her one.
It's not a summer film. That's not
summer.
The aesthetic.
Yeah.
So to answer one of the questions that I'm going to go back far. Go back a bit. You asked, are these in the right order?
Go for it.
So I think that's the one I should try to come back to. And I think the answer is pretty clearly yes. Because Call Me
By Your Name second.
Yes. Because even though I have a pretty strong bias, as you've picked up from my answers to these questions, to chronological order. So, first of all, The Portrait of a Lady is set earlier. Mm-hmm. It's about the history of the queer experience. Call Me By Your Name is aggressively about the modern queer experience, and that's why people seem to like it so much, frankly.
I mean, I think it's the slightly retro queer experience.
So, Call Me By Your Name is obviously set in the 80s, and that has something to do with the story. I think it's interesting how much Guadagnino in particular has really tried to downplay that element. I think in cooperation with Andre. He's talked about, for example, in the costume design, that the costume designer intentionally did a lot of work to find outfits that could have happened in the 80s, but that also people would wear today. Mm-hmm. And they really tried to not distance people from the events that were happening. I think there are a lot of people that saw Call Me By Your Name that did not know that it was set in the 80s.
It does say 1983
You're
at
right.
the beginning.
But I think that a lot of people that didn't, weren't paying attention, didn't. And they're like, oh, people in Italy are kind of old-fashioned in their accoutrement. And there's some truth to that as well. People,
especially when you're just sort of like lounging around at your summer house. No one's seeing you.
I mean,
the sun-faded clothes.
If you step out of the most urban areas of a lot of places in Western Europe, it's going to look a lot like the 80s, actually. Yeah. That kind of checks out. So I think there are a lot of people that didn't see it as a period, had no idea that it wasn't set in 2017. And the novel was set in 1987, but the film time was moved back to 1984 because they wanted it to be totally before the AIDS crisis. And they didn't want that to have anything to do with the story. And this story is about people in an environment that's actually pretty accepting to homophobia or to homosexuality. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely an element of it there, but Portrait of a Lady is very much about the historical queer experience. Call Me By Your Name is only barely about the historical queer experience, and I think both are valid things to do in a film. I think chronologically, it would make more sense to do Portrait of a Lady first, but more importantly, Portrait of a Lady, I think it's good that we can debate whether or not the answers that it gives to some of these questions are the right answers or the wrong answers, because it does try to give answers. Mm-hmm. Is this sad or not? How do these people feel about it? What's going to happen later? We basically get the answer to these questions and we can evaluate them.
Yes, bad, and nothing.
That's right. Whereas in Call Me By Your Name, the answer to these questions are aggressively left open. Oh, I don't know. Is it creepy or is it not creepy? Is it sad or is it not sad? Are they going to get back together or are they not going to get back together? Well, you'll just have to maybe wait for the sequel to find out. Okay, that's a fine answer too. But I think that's much better for something to do at the end of a series. I think Portrait of a Lady, we're presented with something, we can evaluate, we can appreciate it. Call Me By Your Name is kind of a mess. I mean, it's a hard thing to do in a podcast because it's both very small, it's much simpler of a story. There are less events, as the investors would tell us, a lot less conflict in Call Me By Your Name. Really not that much happens. And so the whole film is basically asking us to interpret these images we're seeing and come up with our own judgments about what they mean. And so I think that's much more appropriate. I think Call Me By Your Name is responding to the type of stories that Portrait of a Lady is telling. And even though Portrait of a Lady is telling it in a very modernist, very up-to-date, and innovative way, it's centered more in the bigger picture. I know you said it was the beginning, but as the bigger picture of, I don't remember what you called it, sad lesbian historical stories or whatever.
I just said lesbian period dramas.
Lesbian period dramas.
Some
coincidentally
are often tragedies.
I would say 80%, 70% tragedies, but not all. So it has a tradition that it's fitting into, and I think we can appreciate it as an attempt to be part of that tradition. Call Me By Your Name, much less so, and I think it's actually trying to respond to that tradition and push away from it. So it makes more sense to see something in and then see something that tries to break out.
And almost instantly, we're back to tell you about next month's films. But before we get to that, I do have a correction to the episode you just listened to. I wish to revoke my series title of Unconsumable, and I wish to make the stronger choice of My Gay Summer. My hesitation for My Gay Summer was that it didn't really seem like Portrait of a Lady on Fire occurred during the summer, but because we end the film with Eloise listening to Vivaldi's Estate, or the summer section of his Four Seasons, that's the gay summer. But anyway, for next month, strap on your dancing shoes. We've got 2 musicals.
We are doing The Sound of Music from 1965 and Cabaret from 1972.